The weight of silence. The rain hammered against the windows of the small nursing home in Hartford, Connecticut, creating a rhythmic percussion that had become the soundtrack to Margaret Chen's life. At 68 years old, she had spent the last 3 years caring for residents who had long ago stopped remembering her name, her face, or even their own stories. But there was one resident who remembered everything, perhaps too much. Winston Churchill Davis sat in his wheelchair by the window of room 214, his weathered hands resting on a worn leather journal. At 92, he was the oldest resident at Riverside Care, and certainly the most enigmatic. Despite his age, his mind remained sharp as a tack, his blue eyes still piercing when they fixed on you. He had been named after the famous British Prime Minister by his father, a World War II veteran who had served under Eisenhower. Nurse Chen, Winston's voice cut through the sound of rain, gravelly but clear. Come here, please. I need to tell you something. Margaret finished adjusting Mrs. Patterson's blanket in the next room and walked over to Winston's door. The October afternoon light was fading fast, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. Winston never asked for much, no extra pudding at dinner, no longer visiting hours, no complaints about the food. When he called for her, it was always important. What is it, Mr. Davis? She asked, pulling up the standard-issue plastic chair beside him. Winston's gnarled fingers traced the edge of his journal. For a moment, he said nothing, just stared out at the rain-soaked parking lot below. A young couple was rushing to their car, the woman laughing as the man tried to shield her with his jacket. Winston's expression softened, then hardened again. I received a call today, he said finally. From the Department of Veterans Affairs. They're declassifying some documents from 1945. Documents I thought would die with me. Margaret had worked in elder care for 26 years. She had learned to recognize when a resident needed to talk and when they needed silence. This was a talking moment. She settled back in her chair and waited. Winston opened the journal, revealing pages filled with tight, meticulous handwriting, the kind that spoke of military training and disciplined thought. Newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, were carefully taped between the pages. Margaret caught glimpses of headlines, Germany surrenders, and Hiroshima, the atomic age begins. I was a cryptographer during the war, Winston began, his voice taking on a stronger quality, as if the memories themselves were restoring his vigor. I worked at Arlington Hall, a secret facility in Virginia. We intercepted and decoded enemy communications. Japanese, mostly, by the time I was assigned there in 1944. Margaret nodded. She knew some of this. Winston occasionally mentioned his service, but he had never spoken about it in detail. In early August of 1945, I was part of a small team, only 6 of us, assigned to a special project. We were monitoring high-level Japanese diplomatic cables, trying to gauge their willingness to surrender. The war in Europe had ended in May, but Japan was holding out. The fighting in the Pacific was brutal. Every day, more boys were dying. Winston's hand trembled slightly as he turned a page. A faded photograph slipped out, a young man in military uniform, barely recognizable as the aged man before her. Beside him stood 5 other people, all in uniform, all impossibly young. On August 6th, we received word through our channels that something unprecedented had happened. A single bomb had destroyed the entire city of Hiroshima. We didn't understand it at first, the magnitude was incomprehensible. But our job wasn't to understand. It was to listen and decode. The rain intensified, and somewhere down the hall, a television played the evening news at high volume. Margaret could hear fragments, tensions in the Middle East. And, stock market closing. 3 days later, Nagasaki was bombed. And then, on August 10th, we intercepted a message. It was from the Japanese foreign minister to their ambassador in Switzerland. It was them agreeing to surrender, Margaret. They were ready to accept the Potsdam Declaration, with one condition, that Emperor Hirohito be allowed to remain. Winston's eyes filled with tears, something Margaret had never seen before. But here's what they never told anyone, what got buried in classified files for 80 years. We had intercepted similar messages 2 weeks before Hiroshima. 2 weeks, Margaret. Messages indicating that Japan was seeking a way to surrender, that they were reaching out through back channels to the Soviets, trying to negotiate terms. Margaret felt her breath catch. Are you saying? I'm saying we knew they were looking for a way out. Not all of us, just a handful of people at the highest levels. Truman knew. His advisors knew. And they decided to drop the bombs anyway. The weight of his words hung in the air like the cigarette smoke that used to fill the halls before the smoking ban. Margaret's mind raced, trying to process the implications. The call I received today, Winston continued, was from a researcher at the National Archives. They're preparing to release these documents. My name is in them. My decryption work. After all these years, the truth is coming out, and they want to interview me. Will you do it? Margaret asked quietly. Winston closed his journal and looked directly at her. That's the question, isn't it? I've kept this secret for 79 years. I watched as history was written without this crucial detail. I saw the debates, the justifications, the documentaries, the textbooks all saying the bombs were necessary to end the war and save American lives. But I knew something else. We all did, those of us in that room. Why didn't you speak before? Margaret asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Fear. Patriotic duty. The Official Secrets Act. The very real threat of imprisonment or worse. We were sworn to secrecy on pain of treason charges. One of my colleagues, Sarah Brennan, tried to speak about it in 1952. She was visited by men in dark suits. She never spoke about it again, and she died in 1978 without ever telling her story. I went to her funeral. Her daughter gave the eulogy and talked about what a loyal American her mother was. If she only knew. Winston pulled out another photograph from his journal, a black and white image of a woman in her 30s, smiling at the camera, wearing a military uniform with a cryptographic service badge. Sarah was brave. She was right to try. But I was a coward. I stayed silent. I married, had 3 children, worked as an accountant for 40 years, and never told anyone. Not my wife, God rest her soul. Not my children. Not even when Michael, my youngest, became a history professor specializing in World War II. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. Does he know now? No. Michael thinks his father was a low-level clerk who filed papers. He doesn't know I had the security clearance to access some of the most sensitive intelligence in American history. How do I tell him? How do I tell him that everything he's taught for 30 years might be missing the most important piece? Margaret reached out and placed her hand on Winston's. His skin was paper-thin, marked with age spots and scars from a long life. What did Churchill say? She asked. You mentioned in the title, what did Churchill whisper? Winston smiled grimly. That's the thing. It's not about the British Churchill at all. It's about me. It's what I whispered after I heard the news about Nagasaki. I was alone in the decryption room, late at night, reading a cable that confirmed Japan was ready to discuss surrender terms. And I whispered, we didn't have to do it. God forgive us, we didn't have to do it. A long silence followed. Down the hall, dinner carts were rattling, and the smell of overcooked vegetables wafted through the air. It was 5:47 p.m. on a Thursday evening in October, and the world was about to shift for Winston Churchill Davis. Those words have haunted me every day since, Winston said. And now I have a choice. I can die with my silence, or I can break it and let the world judge me, and judge what really happened. Margaret squeezed his hand gently. You don't have to decide tonight. But I do, Winston said firmly. The researcher wants an answer by tomorrow morning. They're planning a major release, documents, interviews with surviving personnel, the whole thing. It'll be on every news channel, in every newspaper. It'll rewrite what people think they know about the end of World War II. What are you leaning toward? Margaret asked. Winston looked out the window again. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and streetlights were beginning to flicker on across Hartford. Somewhere out there, people were living their lives, eating dinner, helping kids with homework, arguing about politics, falling in love, grieving losses. Normal, everyday life, built on a foundation of history they thought they understood. I'm leaning toward the truth, Winston said quietly. Even if it costs me everything I have left. Even if my children hate me for keeping secrets. Even if the country I served calls me a traitor. I'm 92 years old, Margaret. I've got months left, maybe a year if I'm lucky. What good is silence now? Margaret stood up, her joints protesting after the long day. You're one of the bravest people I've ever met, Mr. Davis. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. Winston looked up at her with those sharp blue eyes. Thank you. But I need you to do something for me. If I do this interview, if I tell the truth, things are going to get complicated. Media, maybe protesters, maybe government officials trying to discredit me. I need someone I trust by my side. I need you to be there. Margaret hesitated. She was a nurse, not a political activist. She had bills to pay, a daughter in college, a mortgage that seemed to grow heavier each month. Getting involved in a historical controversy wasn't part of her job description. But then she looked at Winston, this man who had carried a terrible burden for nearly 8 decades, who had watched history be written incorrectly because he was too afraid or too loyal or too constrained to correct it. She thought about her own father, who had fought in Vietnam and came back changed, broken by things he could never talk about. She thought about truth, and the cost of silence. I'll be there, she said. Winston nodded, a single tear rolling down his weathered cheek. Then I'll make the call tomorrow. I'll tell them yes. God help us all. That night, after her shift ended at 11 p.m., Margaret drove home through the dark, rain-slicked streets of Hartford. The radio played soft jazz, but she barely heard it. Her mind was replaying Winston's words, imagining the decryption room in 1945, imagining a young man reading cables that told him his government was about to kill hundreds of thousands of people when there might have been another way. When she pulled into her driveway, she sat in the car for a long moment, watching raindrops race down the windshield. Tomorrow, everything would change. For Winston. For his family. Maybe for the country. And she had promised to stand beside him through it all. Inside her modest 2-bedroom house, Margaret made a cup of chamomile tea and sat at her kitchen table. She pulled out her laptop and began searching for information about the end of World War II, about the atomic bombs, about the debates that had raged for decades over whether they were necessary. She read for hours, until her eyes burned and her tea grew cold. And slowly, she began to understand the magnitude of what Winston was about to do. The storm breaks. The morning of October 18th dawned cold and clear over Hartford. Margaret had barely slept, her mind churning through possible scenarios, potential consequences. She arrived at Riverside Care at 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes earlier than her usual shift. Winston was already awake, sitting by his window, dressed in his best cardigan, navy blue with leather buttons that his late wife had given him for their 50th anniversary. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I promised I would," Margaret replied. "Have you made the call?" Winston gestured to the phone on his bedside table. "At 8 a.m. That's when Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell from the National Archives said she'd be available. I've been up since 4:30, rehearsing what I'll say." Margaret pulled up a chair. "You don't need to rehearse the truth, Mr. Davis. Just tell it like you remember it." At precisely 8 a.m., Winston picked up the phone with shaking hands and dialed the number. Margaret could hear a woman's voice answer, professional and warm. "Dr. Hartwell speaking." "This is Winston Churchill Davis," he said, his voice stronger than Margaret expected. "I'm calling about the declassification project." "My answer is yes." I'll participate in the interview and provide whatever documentation I still have. There was a pause, then excited conversation on the other end. Winston listened, occasionally nodding, his free hand gripping the arm of his wheelchair. Yes, I understand. The journal is here with me. Next week would be fine. Yes, I'm aware of the implications. I've waited 79 years, Dr. Hartwell. I'm not interested in waiting anymore. When he hung up, Winston looked both relieved and terrified. She's coming here on Tuesday with a film crew. They want to record everything, my testimony, the documents, all of it. She says it'll be part of a major PBS documentary releasing next spring. How do you feel? Margaret asked. Like I've just jumped off a cliff and I'm not sure if there's water or rocks below, Winston admitted. But also, lighter. For the first time in decades, lighter. The weekend passed in relative calm, but Margaret could sense the approaching storm. She spent Saturday afternoon at Winston's request, helping him organize his journal and supporting documents. The material was extensive, coded messages he had secretly copied before leaving Arlington Hall, correspondence with other cryptographers over the years, newspaper clippings tracking the official narrative about the atomic bombs, and his own meticulous notes documenting what he knew and when he knew it. I could go to prison for keeping these, Winston said as they worked. I violated every security protocol by copying them. But I knew someday they'd be important. I just didn't know it would take this long. On Sunday evening, Margaret received an unexpected phone call. It was Winston's son, Michael Davis. Ms. Chen, I need to speak with you about my father. Michael's voice was tight with tension. He called me today and told me something absolutely insane. He claims he's going to be interviewed about secret World War II intelligence. He says he worked on some classified project involving the atomic bombs. This is clearly a delusion, some kind of dementia or false memory. I need you to stop this before he embarrasses himself and our family. Margaret took a deep breath. Professor Davis, I assure you, your father's mind is perfectly clear. What he's telling you is true. That's impossible, Michael said flatly. My father was a clerk. He filed papers. He had no security clearance, no access to sensitive information. I've researched this era extensively. If what he's claiming were true, there would be documentation. There is documentation, Margaret interrupted gently. It's been classified for nearly 80 years. It's being released now. Your father was a cryptographer at Arlington Hall. He decoded Japanese diplomatic cables in 1945. And what he discovered, it's going to change how we understand the end of the war. Silence on the other end. Then, quietly, I need to see my father. Tomorrow. First thing. He'd like that, Margaret said. He wanted to tell you in person, but he was afraid you wouldn't believe him. I don't believe him, Michael said bluntly. But I'll come. 9 a.m. tomorrow. Monday morning arrived with a crisp autumn chill. Margaret had arranged for Winston to use the small conference room at Riverside Care for privacy. Michael Davis arrived exactly at 9 a.m., dressed in a tweed jacket with elbow patches, every inch the history professor. He was 58, with his father's blue eyes but his mother's softer features. Behind him came a woman in her early 50s, well-dressed in a burgundy pantsuit. This is my wife, Patricia, Michael said curtly. She's an attorney. I wanted a witness to whatever is about to be claimed. Winston sat at the head of the small conference table, his journal before him. Margaret stood by the window, giving the family space but ready to intervene if needed. Hello, Michael. Patricia, Winston said quietly. Thank you for coming. Dad, what the hell is going on? Michael's professional composure cracked. You call me out of nowhere and tell me you've been lying to me my entire life. That you were some kind of spy. That you have secret information about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I wasn't a spy, Winston corrected gently. I was a cryptographer. And I haven't been lying, I've been silent. There's a difference. Not much of one from where I'm sitting, Michael shot back. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. Patricia remained standing, her lawyer's instincts clearly engaged, studying Winston carefully. Winston opened his journal and pushed it across the table to his son. Read it. All of it. The entries, the documents, the cables I decoded. Then judge me. Michael looked at the journal as if it might bite him. Slowly, he pulled it closer and began reading. Patricia moved to read over his shoulder. The room fell silent except for the sound of pages turning and, occasionally, Michael's sharp intake of breath. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Margaret watched Winston's face. He looked older somehow, more vulnerable, waiting for his son's verdict. Finally, Michael looked up. His face was pale. These cables, if they're authentic. Dad, do you understand what this means? I've understood for 79 years, Winston said quietly. I understood at the moment I decoded them. I understood it when we dropped the second bomb. I understood it every single day since. Patricia spoke for the first time, her lawyer's voice measured and careful. Mr. Davis, if these documents are what they appear to be, you've been in possession of classified material for 8 decades. You could face serious legal consequences. I'm 92 years old with stage 3 kidney disease, Winston said matter-of-factly. What are they going to do, put me in prison for my last few months? I'm more afraid of dying with this silence than dying in a cell. Michael stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his back to the room. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. My entire career. I've written 3 books about the Pacific War. I've taught thousands of students about the necessity of the atomic bombs, about how they saved lives by ending the war quickly. And you're telling me I've been wrong? That there were alternatives we didn't pursue? I'm telling you the picture was more complicated than what was officially reported, Winston said carefully. I'm not saying the bombs were definitely unnecessary. I'm not a military strategist or a president making impossible decisions. But I am saying we had intelligence suggesting Japan was seeking surrender terms before Hiroshima, and that intelligence was known at the highest levels. What that means, how we judge it, that's for people like you to determine. I'm just telling you what I saw. Michael turned back to face his father. Tears streaked his face. Why didn't you tell me? When I was writing my dissertation, when I was researching my books, when I was teaching. Why did you let me build my career on an incomplete narrative? Because I was sworn to secrecy under penalty of treason, Winston said, his own eyes filling. Because I watched what happened to colleagues who tried to speak. Because I was a coward. Because I convinced myself that my small truth didn't matter against the official story. Because I was wrong. I'm so sorry, Michael. I'm so goddamn sorry. Father and son stared at each other across the conference table, decades of distance and misunderstanding suddenly visible in the morning light. Patricia placed a hand on her husband's shoulder. What happens now? Michael finally asked. Tomorrow, I give an interview, Winston said. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell from the National Archives is coming with a camera crew. It'll be part of a major documentary. The story will break, probably within weeks. And then? I honestly don't know. Media attention, certainly. Possibly government pushback. Historical debate. Maybe legal challenges. You'll need protection, Patricia said immediately, her legal mind engaging. Not physical protection necessarily, but legal representation. There will be people who try to discredit you, to claim the documents are forgeries or that your memory is faulty. You'll need someone who can defend the authenticity of your claims. I can't afford, Winston began, but Patricia cut him off. I'll do it pro bono. This is potentially the most important historical revelation of the century. I want to be part of making sure the truth is heard clearly. Michael wiped his eyes and sat back down. He pulled the journal closer again, reading more carefully this time. These coded messages. Dad, can you still read them? Can you decode them on camera? Winston nodded. The codes are burned into my brain. I could decode Japanese diplomatic cipher in my sleep. I probably do, some nights. Then that's what we do, Michael said, his voice gaining strength. We document everything. We verify everything. We make the case so airtight that no one can dismiss it. Dad, I'm angry, and I'm hurt, and I don't fully understand why you waited this long. But I also understand you were in an impossible position. And if what you're saying is true, and I think it is, then the world deserves to know. Winston's face crumpled with relief. You believe me? I believe you, Michael said softly. I wish you'd told me 30 years ago, but I believe you. The two men stood and embraced, awkwardly at first, then tightly. Margaret felt tears in her own eyes watching them. She had seen many family reconciliations in her years as a nurse, but few as profound as this. The rest of Monday was spent in preparation. Michael cancelled his classes for the week. Patricia started making phone calls to colleagues in constitutional law and military justice. Margaret adjusted her schedule to be available throughout Winston's interview and beyond. At 6 p.m., as Margaret was preparing to leave for the evening, Winston called her back into his room. I want you to have something, he said, reaching into his nightstand. He pulled out a small envelope, yellowed with age. This is a letter Sarah Brennan wrote me in 1952, right after the men in suits visited her. She made me promise not to open it until after her death. I opened it in 1978, the day after her funeral. Margaret opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in neat handwriting, Dear Winston. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I hope you're still alive to carry what we both know. They came today. They didn't threaten me directly, but the message was clear, speak, and suffer consequences. I have children, Winston. I have grandchildren. I can't risk their safety for a truth the world doesn't want to hear. But maybe someday, the world will be ready. Maybe someday, the truth will be less dangerous than silence. If that day comes, and you're still here to see it, I'm asking you to speak. Speak for both of us. Speak for all those Japanese civilians who died when there might have been another way. Speak for the American boys who would have died in an invasion that might never have been necessary. Speak for the truth, even when it's complicated and painful. Don't carry this silence to your grave like I'm about to. When the time is right, break it. Break it for both of us. Your friend, Sarah. Margaret read the letter twice, then looked at Winston. She knew. She knew you'd eventually tell the truth. She had more faith in me than I had in myself, Winston said quietly. But she was right. The time has come. Tomorrow, I speak for both of us. That night, Margaret barely slept again. She kept thinking about Sarah Brennan, about a woman who knew the truth but was too afraid to speak it. She thought about Winston, carrying that burden for nearly 80 years. She thought about Michael, facing the potential collapse of his life's work. And she thought about the thousands of people, Japanese civilians, American soldiers, families on both sides, whose fates had hung on decisions made with incomplete information or willful ignorance. At 3 a.m., unable to sleep, Margaret got up and wrote an email to her daughter, Emily, who was studying journalism at Northwestern University. She told her what was about to happen, about Winston's story, about the choice to speak truth even when it's dangerous. Emily's response came an hour later, Mom, this is incredible. This is the kind of story I became a journalist to cover. Can I come home this weekend? I want to meet Mr. Davis. I want to help tell this story right. Margaret smiled through tears at her laptop screen. Maybe that was how truth survived, passed from one generation to the next, each person choosing to carry it forward despite the cost. The interview. Tuesday, October 22nd arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if even the weather was holding its breath. The camera crew from PBS arrived at Riverside Care at 10 a.m. sharp, 3 people with professional equipment, led by Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and an air of intense focus. Margaret had helped Winston prepare. He wore his best suit, a charcoal gray three-piece that hung a bit loose on his diminished frame but still conveyed dignity. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie, but his eyes were clear and determined. The interview was set up in the facility's library, a quiet room with tall windows and shelves of large print books. Michael and Patricia sat in chairs against the wall, silent witnesses. Margaret stood near the door, ready to intervene if Winston's health became a concern. Dr. Hartwell settled into a chair across from Winston, her notes organized on a clipboard. The cameras began recording, and she started with gentle questions: Winston's background, his recruitment into cryptographic service, his training at Arlington Hall. Winston's voice was steady as he narrated his early war years. "I was good with puzzles, always had been. My commanding officer noticed and recommended me for special training. By early 1944, I was part of the team intercepting and decoding Japanese diplomatic communications." "Can you describe the facility at Arlington Hall?" Dr. Hartwell asked. "It was a former girls' school in Virginia, taken over by the Army. We worked in shifts around the clock, hundreds of people, all doing different aspects of signals intelligence. The Japanese section where I worked was on the second floor. We had about 20 people working on diplomatic codes, completely separate from the military codes. Most people don't realize that there was a difference between what the military was saying and what the diplomats were saying." Dr. Hartwell leaned forward. "And that difference became crucial in August 1945. Winston took a deep breath. This was the moment. This was when everything changed. Yes. Starting in late July 1945, we began intercepting diplomatic cables from Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo to Ambassador Naotake Sato in Moscow.